The crisp autumn wind swirled around the towering brick facade of Jefferson University, a prestigious Ivy League campus tucked into the bustling heart of Washington, D.C. Students streamed across the quad, juggling coffee cups and laptops, buzzing about the upcoming lecture and exclusive guest appearance by Dr. Evelyn Harper, a renowned political science professor known for her unapologetic liberal views. The lecture hall was already packed to capacity, filled with eager undergraduates and faculty members. In the front row, surrounded by two Secret Service agents who tried to blend discreetly with the crowd, sat a quiet but poised Barron Trump, the only child of President Donald J. Trump still living in the White House. At 19 years old, Barron had grown into an impressive figure, tall, with a composed demeanor that echoed his father's confidence but tempered by a quiet introspection that few expected. He was there at the invitation of Professor Harper herself, an invitation sent to the White House under the guise of fostering open political dialogue. But those who knew Dr. Harper suspected she had other motives. She had built a career on skewering conservative figures and had made no secret of her disdain for the Trump administration. Her public jabs at the president had gained viral fame more than once. Many whispered she had only invited Barron to make a statement, to remind everyone that even the most powerful families weren't immune to her wit. As the clock struck noon, Professor Harper swept onto the stage. Dressed in a sleek black blazer and signature thick-rimmed glasses, she radiated confidence. She glanced at Barron briefly before addressing the audience. "Welcome," she began, her voice crisp, "to the modern presidency, power, ego, and the American experiment." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew where this was going. For the first 20 minutes, the lecture proceeded as expected, a historical overview of presidential authority. Barron remained still, occasionally jotting notes, his face unreadable. But then the tone shifted. And, of course, Harper continued, her lips curling into a smirk. No discussion about modern power would be complete without addressing the, shall we say, unique leadership style of our current president, Donald J. Trump. Laughter bubbled up from the audience. She flipped to a slide showing a montage of the president's most infamous moments, gaffes, fiery tweets, and unfiltered press conferences. In the age of social media, she quipped, the line between commander-in-chief and reality TV star has never been thinner. The laughter grew louder and the cameras discreetly panned toward Barron. But to everyone's surprise, he didn't flinch. "And perhaps the most fascinating case study of presidential ego," Harper added, her voice growing sharper, "is when that ego overshadows the nation's best interests. I mean, how many times can one man claim to be the smartest, richest, and most persecuted figure in American history?" More laughter. A student in the back muttered, "At least we're not paying for gold toilets." Professor Harper let the comment hang before delivering her next blow. "Now, some of us here might be intimately familiar with what it's like to grow up under such charismatic leadership." Her eyes landed squarely on Barron. The room quieted as every gaze turned his way. For a moment there was silence. No one dared breathe. The air was heavy with the anticipation of how the president's son would react. Embarrassment? Anger? Would he storm out? Instead, Barron Trump calmly placed his pen down and stood up. His towering frame and composed posture made the room seem suddenly smaller. When he spoke, his voice was even and self-assured, but there was an edge to it, a quiet force that demanded attention. "With all due respect, Professor Harper," he began, "I came here today because I believe this was an institution where ideas, all ideas, could be discussed fairly and openly. But it seems that even here, in one of America's most celebrated universities, there's room only for one narrative." A stunned murmur swept through the hall. Harper's smirk faltered for the first time. "You've spent the last 10 minutes mocking my father," Barron continued, his voice steady but sharp. "And that's your right. Free speech is something my family will always defend. But the irony is, in your rush to reduce him to a caricature, you've missed what millions of Americans see." He paused, letting his words hang heavy. Even the cameras stopped moving. "My father isn't perfect. But while you're up here making jokes," he said, locking eyes with Harper, "he's working, fighting to make sure the families who don't have the luxury of sitting in Ivy League lecture halls have a future." The room held its collective breath. No one moved. No one dared. "And if you think a few slides and clever sound bites can erase that," Barron added, his voice cold as steel, "you underestimate the real America." He sat back down without another word, leaving the hall in stunned silence. For the first time in her career, Professor Harper didn't have a comeback. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Professor Harper, usually razor-sharp with her comebacks, stood frozen at the podium. The air was thick, no more chuckles, no sarcastic whispers. Even the students who had laughed the loudest moments ago shifted uncomfortably in their seats, stealing glances at Barron Trump. He remained still, his expression unreadable. But beneath that calm exterior, his words echoed like a thunderclap, a reminder that no matter how much people mocked his father, there was a deeper truth they couldn't dismiss. Professor Harper cleared her throat, trying to reclaim control. "Well," she said, forcing a smile, "I suppose we should welcome differing perspectives. After all, that's democracy, isn't it?" Her attempt to downplay the moment fell flat. The room wasn't laughing anymore. Barron leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his hands together. "It's more than democracy, Professor," he said quietly but firmly. "It's reality." A ripple of tension spread through the room. For a moment, it seemed like he had flipped the script, the mocker had become the one being challenged. Still, Professor Harper wasn't ready to back down completely. "Reality is subjective, Mr. Trump," she said, her tone sharpening again. "And history will decide how your father is remembered, not you, not me." Barron tilted his head, considering her words carefully. "History doesn't write itself," he replied, "people do. And I'd rather be remembered for standing up for something real than tearing others down to get applause." His words landed hard. Several students murmured in agreement, a surprising turn given the university's traditionally liberal leanings. Even the Secret Service agents exchanged brief glances of surprise. Harper shifted uncomfortably behind the podium. She wasn't used to losing control of a room, especially not to a teenager who had, until now, been viewed by most as an afterthought in the political landscape. "So," Barron continued, his voice still calm, "if we're going to talk about power, let's be honest. My father didn't build his career by making fun of others. He built it by fighting for what he believes in even when it wasn't popular." A wave of quiet affirmation spread across the lecture hall. More and more students were nodding, the usual air of condescension replaced by something else, respect. And for the first time in her career, Dr. Evelyn Harper felt it slip away. Later that evening, the towering marble columns of the White House gleamed beneath the soft golden glow of the setting sun. In the private residence, Barron Trump sat across from his father, who was reviewing documents spread across the polished oak desk. Donald Trump looked up, his familiar sharp blue eyes scanning his son's face. "So," he said, leaning back, "I heard you had an interesting day at that fancy school." Barron smiled faintly. "It was eventful," he admitted. The president grinned. "They tried to roast me, didn't they?" "Something like that," Barron said. "But I didn't let it slide." A rare flicker of pride crossed Donald Trump's face. "Good," he said. "Never let anyone tell you who you are, or who I am. They love their jokes, but when things get tough, we're the ones who show up." Barron nodded but hesitated. "Do you ever get tired of it?" he asked softly. The president's expression softened, something few outside his family ever saw. "Every day," he admitted. "But here's the thing, Barron, when you stand for something real, people will always try to tear you down. The trick is you don't let them." For a moment, father and son sat in silence, the weight of their shared legacy settling between them. Finally, Donald Trump chuckled. "And hey, if that professor wants to make jokes, let her. We're still here." Barron smiled, but deep down he knew today had changed something. Not just for him, but for everyone who had been watching. By the following morning, the internet was on fire. Clips of Barron Trump's calm but cutting response to Professor Harper had gone viral, spreading like wildfire across every major social media platform. Conservative commentators hailed him as a rising voice for the next generation, while liberal critics scrambled to downplay his words as nothing more than well-rehearsed talking points. But no matter which side people were on, there was no denying the truth. Barron Trump had stolen the spotlight. Cable news stations looped the footage endlessly. "The silent Trump speaks," one cheer blared. Pundits debated his poise and intelligence, many admitting grudgingly that the young Trump had handled the situation with remarkable maturity. At Jefferson University, things were tense. Professor Harper sat alone in her office, scrolling through the hundreds of emails flooding her inbox. Some applauded her for challenging power, but many others didn't. Alumni criticized her for turning an academic lecture into a personal attack. Students who once admired her cutting wit now questioned whether she had crossed a line. A soft knock at her door made her look up. It was Dean Patricia Reynolds, a stern woman with silver hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Dr. Harper," the dean began, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "We need to talk." Harper braced herself. "I'm receiving calls, a lot of calls, from donors," Reynolds continued, her tone tight. "Many feel that your comments yesterday were unprofessional." Harper scoffed. "Since when did we start worrying about hurting politicians' feelings?" The dean's expression hardened. "We're not talking about feelings, we're talking about integrity. Your job is to foster debate, not publicly humiliate the son of the sitting president." For the first time, Harper felt a sliver of doubt creep in. Had she gone too far? In the West Wing, senior staff gathered in the sleek, glass-lined Situation Room not to discuss foreign policy, but to assess the fallout. At the head of the table sat Donald Trump himself, reviewing social media trends flashing across multiple monitors. He tapped his fingers on the table, a satisfied smile curling his lips. "They wanted a show," he said, glancing at his chief of staff. Barron gave them one. The staff chuckled uneasily. Even they were surprised by the young Trump's performance. A communications aide spoke up. "The response has been overwhelmingly positive with our base. Barron's speech is being shared by independent voters, too. Sir, this could be a major political win." Trump leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. "I told you," he said smugly, "he's got the Trump genes." But not everyone in the room was relaxed. Ivanka Trump, Barron's older half-sister, frowned slightly. "Dad," she said carefully, "is Barron okay? He never wanted the spotlight. And now the entire country is watching him." For a rare moment, Donald Trump's bravado slipped. He knew Ivanka was right. Barron had never been like the others. He preferred books over cameras, quiet over chaos. And yet here he was, thrust onto center stage. He exhaled deeply. "He's tougher than he looks," Trump said, though his voice was softer. "But I'll check in with him." The unexpected visitor. That evening, Barron was sitting in the White House library, a towering room lined with leather-bound books. His phone buzzed constantly, texts from classmates, political figures, even a few celebrities who admired his boldness. But one message stood out. "Unknown number. I owe you a conversation. Can we meet? Professor Harper." Barron's eyebrows lifted in surprise. Of all the reactions he expected, this wasn't one of them. After a moment's thought, he typed a reply. "Barron. Tomorrow. Noon. The Lincoln Memorial." He hit send, wondering what she could possibly want. The next day, the air around the Lincoln Memorial was crisp and cool. Tourists milled about, snapping photos of the towering marble statue, but Barron Trump stood quietly at the top of the steps, hands tucked into the pockets of his navy coat. He had arrived early, too early, a habit he picked up from his father. Despite the swirling media frenzy, he had managed to slip away with the help of a few discreet Secret Service agents who stood at a respectful distance. At exactly noon, Professor Harper appeared. She looked different, less self-assured than she had during her lecture. Her usually sharp expression was softer, her shoulders tense as she approached the young man she had publicly ridiculed just a day before. Barron turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Professor," he greeted, his voice calm. Harper hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she admitted. "You asked," Barron said simply. "So, why are you here?" The professor exhaled, folding her arms across her chest. "Look," she began, "I'm not here to defend what I said. I crossed a line." For a moment, Barron said nothing, letting her words hang in the air. "Why did you do it?" he finally asked. Harper looked away, gazing at the statue of Abraham Lincoln. "Because it's easy," she confessed. "Mocking your father? It gets a reaction. And in my world, reactions matter. Even if they're wrong?" Barron pressed. Harper flinched at his bluntness but didn't look away. "I thought I was being clever. But after you spoke, well, you made me realize that I wasn't being fair." Barron tilted his head slightly, curiosity flickering in his pale blue eyes. "So, you came to apologize?" The professor's lips curled into a faint smile. "Not exactly. I came to understand." Barron let out a soft chuckle, surprising her. "Understand what?" Harper took a step closer, lowering her voice. "I teach about power, but I don't live it. You do. And despite everything people say, you didn't lash out. You didn't play the victim. You stood your ground. Why?" For the first time, Barron hesitated, unsure if she truly wanted to hear the answer. But after a moment, he spoke. "Because I've had to," he said quietly. "You think it's easy growing up with my name? People don't care who I am, they care about who my father is. And when you mocked him, you weren't just mocking a president, you were mocking my family." The raw honesty in his voice caught Harper off guard. She had expected arrogance, maybe even anger, but not this. "So," Barron continued, "I decided to remind you that we're real people, not just headlines." Harper nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. "And you did," she admitted. "You made me question whether I'm really teaching students to think critically or just feeding them what they want to hear." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The distant hum of the city filled the silence, broken only by the occasional click of a tourist's camera. Finally, Barron spoke again. "If you want to understand power," he said, his tone thoughtful, "stop mocking it and start listening." Harper let out a dry chuckle, shaking her head. "You sound more like a politician than a teenager." Barron smiled faintly. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe I just know what it's like to be judged by people who don't know me." The professor extended her hand. "For what it's worth, I respect you. And I'll do better." Barron hesitated only a moment before shaking her hand. "Good," he said. "Because whether people like it or not, we're not going anywhere." That evening, as the sun dipped below the Washington skyline, Barron returned to the White House. He found his father in the Oval Office, scanning a fresh stack of reports. Donald Trump looked up when Barron entered, setting the papers aside. "Well?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "How'd it go with your favorite professor?" Barron laughed softly, settling into a chair across from his father's desk. "She wanted to understand," he said. The president leaned back in his chair, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "And what did you tell her?" Barron's smile faded slightly, his voice quiet but firm. "That people like her don't scare me, and that we're not going anywhere." A slow smile spread across Trump's face. "That's my boy." For once, no more words were needed. In the days following Barron Trump's public confrontation with Professor Harper, the nation's conversation shifted. Cable news anchors, social media influencers, and even late-night comedians couldn't stop talking about the young man who had refused to back down. For a country exhausted by partisan bickering, Barron's calm yet powerful words had struck a nerve on both sides of the aisle. At Jefferson University, the fallout from Professor Harper's remarks wasn't over. Faculty members debated the boundaries of free speech versus professional ethics. Some defended Harper's right to critique public figures, while others argued that targeting a teenager, even one from the first family, was a step too far. Eventually, under pressure from the university's board of trustees and a wave of disapproving alumni, Harper issued a formal apology. "My words were meant to challenge ideas, not people. I failed to live up to that standard, and for that I apologize, especially to Barron Trump." But by then, the world had already moved on to the next headline, the next controversy. A quiet moment in the White House. One evening, days after the incident, Barron stood on the Truman balcony, gazing across the National Mall. The city twinkled beneath him, but his thoughts were far away. A familiar voice broke the silence. "You know," Donald Trump said, stepping beside his son, "when I was your age, no one expected much from me either." Barron smiled faintly. "And look how that turned out," he quipped. Trump chuckled, clapping a hand on his son's shoulder. "You did good, kid. Better than most of the so-called professionals around here." For all his father's bluster, Barron could sense something deeper beneath his words: pride. The kind of pride that no speechwriter or press release could manufacture. "You didn't have to speak up," Trump continued, his voice unusually soft. "Most people would have let it slide." Barron turned to face his father. "I couldn't," he said simply. "If I didn't stand up for us, who would?" For a moment, Donald Trump said nothing. Then, with a rare glimpse of vulnerability, he nodded. "You're right," he admitted. "And I'm proud of you for it." The nation watches on. In the weeks that followed, Barron's moment at Jefferson University became something more than a viral sensation. It became a symbol. To his supporters, he represented a new generation of leadership, one that wasn't afraid to push back against academic and media elites. To his critics, he was a reminder that the Trump dynasty wasn't fading away anytime soon. But to Barron himself? It was just another day in a life he never asked for but had long since accepted. Months later, in the quiet of the White House library, Barron received an envelope marked with the Jefferson University seal. Inside was a handwritten letter from Professor Harper. "Dear Barron, I still don't agree with everything your father stands for, but I respect the way you carry yourself. You reminded me that behind every headline is a person, and for that, I'm grateful. I hope our paths cross again someday on fairer terms. Sincerely, Dr. Eleanor Harper. Barron smiled softly, folding the letter and tucking it into the pages of a nearby book. He wasn't sure if their paths would cross again, but if they did, he would be ready. Because he understood something now, something his father had known all along. When the world mocks you, you have two choices: stay silent or speak your truth. And Barron Trump had chosen to speak. The world would never forget it.